All right. Hello, hello. Good evening, and welcome to another one of our DC Who's Art and Culture events. For those that are returning, welcome back. I love to see familiar faces and read some of these familiar names. And for those that are new to these events, this is our way to continue to bring you all a front row and authentic look into some diverse and creative alumni. My name is Kim Edwards, and I am one of two co-chairs for the club here in Washington, D.C. Tonight's conversation will hopefully give you a good glance and maybe have a new lens on historic preservation, sustainability, and activism from a senior architect with Quinn Evans. She is a recipient of the 2018 Emerging Architect Award, the intellect behind Tangible Remnants podcast, and CEO of her own practice, Mrs. Nakita Reed. Welcome.
1 second. I think I'm muted. I just totally did that on the wrong side. Sorry. So I just wanted to make sure that you can hear me and see me, if it would let me do that. Okay, great. And so I'm actually a former business owner. I'm currently at Quinn Evans. And so I'm so excited to be here. There's not that many architects that are Black females. There weren't that many architects from UVA. So I wanted to give a little bit of background and set the context a little bit for what we're going to talk about. So let me go ahead and share my screen and we'll get this going. It's like we practiced this.
No worries. I just appreciate you being here with us. I know you've been booked and busy, as we've seen online.
Yes, I so appreciate the opportunity to come back and chat and share a little bit with some who's. All right, good. So I just wanted to give a quick lineage and then we'll go through a couple slides just to help orient everyone about historic preservation, architecture, sustainability. So I went to UVA and graduated in 2006. After that, I then went to the University of Pennsylvania to get my master's in architecture and my master's in historic preservation. I also got a certificate in sustainable architecture. Because for me, architecture and sustainability and preservation have always worked together. I never saw myself as an architect that was only going to do new construction because architecture always had so much to do with existing buildings. And so from the preservation side, I was always intrigued by existing and historic buildings because of the sustainability aspect of it. I was less concerned with the historic building because some dead old white guy was there, and was more concerned with what this building is, what it could be for the current people who live on the planet, and then also for the future generation. So for me, preservation and sustainability have always been two sides of the same coin, where sustainability is making sure that what we're doing now isn't impeding future generations from living their best lives. And then preservation is making sure that we're communicating the important things about our past to the future. So I've always seen them hand in hand. So that being said, I'm just as much architect as I am preservationist. Same way, I'm equally Black and female. I can't say I'm more one or the other. But this slide, I just want to show that these are my preservation creds. So I'm a huge nerd, in case you guys haven't picked up on that. So I did intern at the National Trust for Historic Preservation for a little bit. And then after that, I was the the chapter president for APT DC, and APT is the Association for Preservation Technology. So it's kind of like the American Institute of Architects, but for preservationists. So that's the organization that's looking at what type of mortar needs to be used, what's happening with the brick. There's some sort of historic issue or material issue with the historic building. Let's talk about it. So that's what that group is. I'm currently on the board of Preservation Maryland, and I'm also one of the co-chairs for the Zero Net Carbon Collaborative, which is a smaller organization within the Association of Preservation Technology, really trying to get historic and existing buildings to the climate action conversation. Because it's really frustrating. There are plenty of people who don't understand what existing and historic buildings have to do or why they're even involved in the climate action conversation. So one of the quotes I wanted to jump into before just to continue orienting everyone, this is a quote from Brent Leggs. He is the executive director of the AfricanAmerican Heritage Action Fund at the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And it says, preservation makes the gap between space and time disappear, unlike other forms of history. There is power in preservation. And I really love this quote because it's one of those things where our past has so many meanings for so many people. And historically, preservation has not done a great job of telling the full history and telling the full story. Preservation has been very focused on, think of it as a spotlight. We've been telling the historical narrative of the country, spotlighting and focusing more so on the white male, but we're really trying to bring up the house lights and tell everyone's narrative, because there have been so many contributions from so many different cultures to this country for so long. And so whether it's sites like Baltimore Penn Station, which is one of the projects that I'm working on currently, so a historic photo on the left and then a current photo on the right. So we're working through the future of this building, or even sites like Minokan, which was the home to Francis Lightfoot Lee. He was one of the Virginia signers of the Declaration of Independence, former plantation site. It's a ruin, but it's just a fascinating history and tangible material that's there. And then even on the bottom, let's see, bottom right, so that's a photo of recent graffiti on the Decatur House in DC. And so the tagging of how long, how long do we have to keep telling you Black Lives Matter on a former house that had slave quarters in it, I thought was just a really interesting juxtaposition between historic elements, historic fabric, current events, and contextualizing the history. So I really like historic buildings. I think they have so much history to share. And then final slide in this introduction before we get back to our conversation. So this is why buildings matter in terms of the climate conversation. The operations of buildings consume more energy than the industry and transportation are combined. And so the fact that buildings are consuming 47% of US energy compared to other sectors, we're also consuming a vast amount of the electricity in the country, and we're also emitting a lot of CO2. So focusing on the existing buildings, the buildings that we already have here and how they're operating, the embodied energy that they have, what we can do to actually repurpose and reuse buildings is really going to make a big impact on climate change and just really what we're doing as humans. So I'll pause there. I know that was a lot very quickly, but just wanted to kind of lay the groundwork for where we're going and how my mind works, and it's all connected.
Yes, I love all of the intricate pieces and how you've woven them all together. You mentioned the climate, and we'll definitely come back to that because I have some questions to dive into it. But first, definitely want to say thank you for providing us with kind of the what and the why and that foundation. I know that some of us are really well versed in what an architect is and how they work, but that additional layer of historic and sustainable preservation, you gave a lot of clarity to. I liked that you mentioned the historical narrative, so to speak, and you brought up some different cultures and their contributions. I want to expand upon what that means because it reminds me actually of an article probably 1 or 2 years ago in the Architecture and Design magazine that spoke to describing design as like a pathway, so to speak, for inclusion, for equity and representation, and of course, all the facets that you've already mentioned of interconnectedness of people and what is true history. As a professional, what are your thoughts on that statement, that comparison of architecture and a pathway to inclusion and representation?
I think that it makes a lot of sense, particularly because design is not neutral. Everything that happens from where the roads get built to what buildings get built and approved and how they get built, it's all methodical, designed. Permits have to happen. There's a process and a thought process that happens to it. So the fact that our current built environment was designed specifically as it is now means that design has a role to play in the future and how we shape the future of our cities and how we live. And so it's one of those things where it's just a reminder. I think often we're like, oh, well, this is just how it's always been. But that's not the case. Like if things were designed specifically. So even thinking about urban renewal and the number of neighborhoods that were displaced in order to let highways run through them, and how the built environment really, how it's shaped by different decision makers. And so who are making the decisions about whose lives and whose neighborhoods get destroyed for modern conveniences. So that's a conversation that needs to be had. And so then even it's also thinking about the narrative of whose history gets told, and the frustration that I often had as a Black student in predominantly white schools was that when Black History Month came around, everyone looked at me like I should have all the answers because I was the Black student, but I was getting the same education that they were in the same school. So the fact that like Black history was always an option as opposed to part of the historical canon was always frustrating, particularly because contributions of Black Americans shaped America. Like we've all had a history to play in this, and I think being able to share that narrative and actually highlight more of the contributions makes a difference and just enriches everyone.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I am just jumping for joy internally because some of the things that you're saying spark so many questions. And I really want to dive into as much as possible. So, on that vein of really understanding from multiple perspectives, like you said, you went to UVA, you went to Penn, there are several high academic institutions that have given you a lot of insight and skill and knowledge, but also somewhat mirror what realistically is still the profession of architecture. I think I would be naive to think that it's changed vastly over the last decade or so. And so I suspect you are still one of few, whether at the workplace or at conferences, on a project perhaps. And really, how does your background and experience being at UVA helped maybe, or maybe just giving you more of a consciousness and awareness to how you approach, the world now in the profession?
Yeah, so UVA was culture shock for me. And I say that, and y'all might laugh at me, but it is what it is. We're all who's here. It's fine. Or most of us maybe. And so I grew up in Northern Virginia. I was very fortunate to grow up in a very diverse area. I went to Falls Church High School, very diverse. So we had like 60 plus different cultures, lots of exposure to multiple different people. I did not realize that Black people were still treated differently until I got to UVA. That was surprising for me, but it was also interesting because I ended up being too Black for the white people and too white for the Black people. So there was a moment in time where at UVA I really just had to find people that could let me be me. So I really did hang out with the Indian Student Association and a lot of my Indian friends for the first like 3 to 4 weeks of school as I was kind of navigating that first year life. So I've always been very comfortable in mixed spaces. And often I'm kind of like, I end up being like the Black friend that my white friends feel comfortable asking me uncomfortable questions, and then kind of like the translator elsewhere, if that makes sense. Kind of, I tend to code switch when needed. And like an example of that would be, even, we all do it. We all went to UVA, so we all refer to ourselves as first year, second years, whatever. But when we're talking to someone who didn't go to UVA, it's like, oh, right, first year, I mean freshman. Like it's that language and that translation to help people understand where you're coming from. So yeah, it's, I rambled a little bit and I lost it. But well, did I answer your question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, because we're going to continue. There's a lot to unpack there. And you are correct. I also went to UVA, obviously, and felt a lot of the same expectations, we'll say, to be that voice, be that clarity, to be that safe space for some, and in a different program than you, but mirrored the experience, unfortunately. And I think that for some, it, like you, was a culture shock, but also helps propel you in certain facets of life, because now that you are in this other professional space where it may mirror what you had learned from your time at UVA, you also have learned to navigate and to advocate in a way that others may not have or may not have practiced, so to speak. And I definitely would love you to speak to that. And yeah. I agree. Beyond the code switching, microaggressions happen. That's a part of it.
Right.
What other things have you learned that you've able to either capitalize on or be an advocate for?
Yeah. So UVA, the foundation that was set there was amazing. Like it's one of those things where UVA and Charlottesville will always hold a special place in my heart for the foundation and just the knowledge that I attained there. And so being able to take up space, have conversations, actually know the jargon, and feel comfortable in the architectural profession was something that the studio culture at UVA taught us how to do, because we were always having to defend our ideas, have the conversation, have the backup. and being able to really put our ideas forth and focus on the idea as opposed to kind of the personal attacks or anything like that. So the architectural training at UVA was really fantastic. And it was funny because when I got to Penn, there was probably like 4 or 5 other of us from UVA who also ended up at Penn for grad school. And one of the common compliments, if you will, from our Penn professors was, well, you're doing good for a UVA student. And it was like, oh, it was one of those like backhanded compliments, like, wait, what? What does that mean? But it was one of those things where it was just kind of different design philosophies. So whereas I would say UVA was more interested in making sure that we were going to become licensed architects and had that solid foundation, whereas Penn was much more interested in making sure that we were good designers and they could care less if we actually became licensed. So it was an interesting kind of change that way. So it was UVA, the foundation of UVA, and being able to talk to people about architecture from various different levels. Some people who had parents as architects, some people who had never met an architect before. So that exposure was really helpful.
Wow, that's very interesting to hear. And I'm sure all of us probably were taken aback by that comment, a little offended, maybe.
Right, exactly.
Like, wait a minute, I'm very proud. Double who, in fact.
Exactly.
Yes. It's interesting, too, that you mentioned the different philosophies, right? And that happens a lot of times at different schools in general, high caliber schools, but they're different for reasons, not only by region or by location geographically, but by what they want their students to create, produce, walk away with, right, when they leave their institution. And you mentioned that one versus another may have given you more of a broad and holistic scope on what it really means to be an architect and the influence and power that you have on environment of people, places, homes, history, and the true function, really. You mentioned something that I don't know if everyone in the audience understands, so I want to have you clarify. You mentioned that being licensed is something that is not necessary. And can you give some background as to why it's important, or maybe not to some, but
Gotcha.
yeah.
Yeah. And so, so being a licensed architect is necessary if you want to do anything other than single family residential. In terms of, just to help you get some scale, there are about 115,000 licensed architects in the country. Of that number, less than 2% are African American. And of that 2% of 115,000, there are about almost 500 Black female architects. And I'm happy to see that Marnique's on here too, so there's another one. But there's not many of us in the country. And I didn't realize that there was such a small number. But it kind of makes sense in terms of when you start thinking about, well, when were women actually allowed to start attending university, getting degrees, getting licensed, becoming architects? So, you know, there's a time lag and some catch up that is happening, but it's a slow process. All that being said, being licensed is important if you're trying to do more than single family residential. And I would definitely recommend that everyone who is studying get licensed. It is important, and it also does give that extra layer of credibility, because even having all the credentials that I have, it shields me once people know my credentials, but up until that point, it's kind of just like, oh, well, who are you, little lady? What are you doing? Oh, like it's interesting. So like having credentials and licenses and actually the knowledge to do the work helps.
Wow, that's notable too. Do you feel like it opens doors for you, or do you feel as though it kind of
100%.
Yeah,
100%. The level of respect that is given once people realize that, oh, you are a licensed architect. Okay. Also because legally you are not allowed to call yourself an architect if you are not licensed. And so one of the backhanded microaggressions that I often got when I got licensed was, I'd say, oh yes, I'm an architect. Oh, but are you licensed? You can't call yourself an architect if you're not licensed. I'm well aware of that. And yes, I'm an architect. Like, I know the rules, I'm playing by them. Yes, I'm an architect.
Yes. Yes, exactly. Like, that's a fact. And
Right.
as we continue the conversation.
Exactly.
Right. I wonder, not to go too much into that vein, but how often you said that the percentage of not only Black architects, Black female architects. And in this area, so to speak, in this region, how often people have to answer that question, how often people have to prove themselves in ways that maybe their counterparts do not. And I think that you being present and others really help pave that way, just like many did before, not to belittle those that have come before you all, but it's definitely still a road that needs to be traveled, a road that needs to be marked and indicated and shared. On that same vein, what systems or programs are available for maybe a young aspiring architect?
Yes, well, there are so many. And by so many, I'm going to point directly to the National Organization of Minority Architects. And so NOMA has this really great, I guess, initiative called Project Pipeline, where they're really trying to work with students in high school and college to really expose them to architecture and get them more involved in the profession. And then once there are architecture students who are already at university, they have a NOMA Fellows, I'm pretty sure it's the name of it. It's a new program this year where basically NOMA is helping to match students of architecture with firms and make sure it's paid internships and all of that. And NOMA is a really great organization, and it's for all the minorities, including women. So it's really just a way to try and help give more of a voice to architects who are looking at a profession that doesn't necessarily reflect back to them. So it's a great organization that really is, I've been enjoying it. And actually I was involved in NOMAS, which is the student organization of NOMA. Yes, we know in Spanish it means no more, but it's neither here nor there. But the NOMAS, we had a chapter when I was at UVA, and it was good to be involved in that.
Oh, that's wonderful. And just like a side tidbit,
That's fine. A little plug for NOMA.
Yeah, yes. There is something that you made note to about this upcoming generation, and I love that high schoolers, so not just first and second year college students, but before they get there, because you mentioned that some of your colleagues or classmates, I guess at the time, had parents that were architects or had been to different firms or just seen it, knew what it was. So there's that accessibility that perhaps I think it sounds like NOAA is really trying to give it to as many students as possible and allow them to not only identify and see that it's an option, but kind of give them that guidance too.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's an option. Because I mean, I can't even tell you how many times, even more like within the past 10 years, people are like, oh, you're an architect? Isn't that a weird profession for a woman? It's like, all right, nope, it's not. There's lots of us. There's lots, but there could be more. Let me preface it.
It's not an abundance, but we can always increase that.
Exactly. We're here.
Yes, yes. Well, and especially tapping into that younger generation, whether it's high school or even I looked online and I saw there are some, it looks like camps and things for those that want to just kind of dabble and see if that's what they're interested in. In this time of what I like to call the TikTok social media generation, there are lots of aspects of millennial life and things like I said, challenges on social media, Pokemon Go, all these things that are getting people out, but they're also aware of what's around them.
Right.
How do you think architects or people that are in that field are adapting and evolving to really increase the exposure to historic treasures, but to maybe a younger generation?
Yeah, so technology is becoming a bigger and bigger impact on all of our lives and all aspects of it, and architecture clearly is no different. So at the practice level, it's being a lot of 3D images, augmented reality is starting to come into play, as well as typically physical models or something that architects will build or outsource to get built. But now there are holograms. So basically there are companies that will now do a hologram of your building. So you can like spin it around and show it to the client or do some 3D walk views with the goggles. And then there's also an organization that's working on trying to answer the question, who's going to tell the artificial intelligence, the AI, what culture and what history is important to document and to share. And so it's been really interesting, some of the work that's happening in terms of geolocating and tagging different things to make sure that there's information that's getting uploaded into the AI, whatever that becomes, but then also trying to just get people more out into the built environment. And in the time of COVID, it's been interesting how many museums are opening up virtually and how many tours are starting to happen. So I think we're even seeing it in home sales and real estate as well, in terms of Redfin and 3D floor plans, and really trying to get people to see the 3D version and virtual space of physical buildings. So it'll be interesting to see how that keeps evolving.
Yeah, for sure. There's so many instances, I think, even just either my personal life or those that I know that have bought homes recently, and those that are really trying to get out there and see museums, other events that my colleague and I have tried to actually plan for the DC Who's are those type of tours. So people
Right.
really can get out there as much as possible and see what's in their neighborhood,
Mm-hmm.
really. Um, I, for one, live in the district, and specifically in Anacostia, which has a lot
Mm-hmm.
of historic sites, both landscape, physical architecture, um, everything really is historic in some sort of way. You mentioned local residents and getting people aware and engaging. How do you increase that engagement to really navigate towards the preservation, and really make people aware that they do need to advocate to some degree for their communities?
Yeah, that is a struggle, particularly in DC. For those of you who live in a historic district or have um, not had pleasant experiences with the Historic Preservation Review Board or any sort of, how do I preface this? Most of the time, the interaction people have with the Historic Commission is a negative one, because they're going to the Historic Commission to ask permission to do something to their property because their property is in a historic district. So really helping the owners, the residents, understand the importance of the history and the historic district, helping to advocate for kind of why that's there, and being able to be more transparent on what it means. And all that is something that I know a lot of homeowners associations are doing, and a lot of local preservation organizations are trying to do as well. I know the DC Preservation League is trying to spread the word and help people understand the importance of it. But it's really just a lot of word of mouth and making people aware of the tools that are already out there, and the walking tours, the lots of the history. 'Cause everyone loves a good story, and I think once people understand the history and they're able to tie that narrative to a place and set themselves in that history and in that narrative, then I think that makes a bigger impact for them to understand.
I definitely agree with that. And the history and the story, really sticking to that word, the story, because stories evolve as people come and people go, but there's got to be something or someone to tell that story, so to speak.
Right.
And
Right.
right, you mentioned earlier some of that technology and AI, and I'm thinking about this coexistence, so to speak, of past and present. So, past, we have phenomenal, time honored remnants of history all around us that are significant. But then we do want to still be able to move forward in our technology and infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think we find a place of somewhat of a happy medium?
So my initial response is going to be adaptive reuse. Like that's the it's my jam. And so the idea of using an existing building and reusing it for a new use. And so we see that all the time, whether it's old mills that become apartments, old factory stores that come into some sort of commercial space, being able to reuse a historic building for a new purpose creates this really interesting juxtaposition between the old and the new, and keeps that story going forward. So it just becomes another chapter in the book of the building, as opposed to having to tear the building down, send it all to the landfill, all of the waste of embodied energy and all that. So it's really, adaptive reuse really does provide that link between the two. And there's plenty of historic preservation incentives to try to help building owners adaptively reuse their buildings in a way that still respects the historic fabric, but gives them the tools that they need to then reinvigorate the building. Because ultimately, buildings need people and people need buildings. And so if we have historic buildings that are vacant, that aren't being used, that are sitting there dilapidating, then not only are they going to become a location for unsavory activities, they're also going to get water into the building, and water destroys buildings all day, every day. And so if a building starts to rot and is no longer structurally stable and basically if it falls into too much disrepair and the numbers make more sense to tear it down than to renovate it, that's a loss to the community, that's a loss to the environment. And so being able to actually adaptively reuse the building so that the building can be used for the future is actually going to be the way that it goes forward and doesn't stop the progress of development that's still going to keep happening.
That sounds wonderful. And I think we all have seen buildings that you look and you're like, oh, 2 years ago that was nothing, and now it's this fantastic museum or a shop or boutique.
Yeah, exactly. And it's really interesting because I studied abroad in England for a little bit before, or when I was at Penn. And so it's always interesting talking to preservationists in other countries, particularly countries that are older than ours, because they look at us and our kind of the way that we preserve buildings over here as they say that we treat them too preciously. And one of the English preservationists and architects I was talking to was like, we have castles older than your country. You can do what you want to that building. It was like, he was very dismissive and very much like, the buildings will be okay. We've been doing this for a long time. We know how to make the buildings last and keep lasting. So just do what you need to do to the building. Yeah.
Yeah. I love that. I feel like we need to mention that more often. That just building will be okay.
Right. Context helps.
Yes, for sure. And I love that you mentioned the historic preservation and different ways to preserve and repurpose. I think that is something that we maybe know for other entities and for other tangible objects, but a building is also tangible. So it too can be repurposed. It just depends on having that vision, so to speak.
Right. And it's fun. So it's also really cool for me whenever I'm working on a really historic building. At the moment, I'm thinking of, I worked on the grist mill in Perryville. So Perryville, Maryland. And it was like 1750 or so is when it was originally constructed. So the plaster still has the horsehair in there and all that. And so when looking at the building and seeing the horsehair of a horse that died like 2 centuries ago, and thinking about the people that actually constructed the building and standing in the place where I know someone stood hundreds of years ago, it has a really interesting feeling for me. But then also it was fun because the contractor didn't really have a sense of why preservation mattered. And he was, when I'm ever talking to contractors, I try and make sure that we're all on the same page. This is why it's important. And so he was like, well, who was president when this building was built? And I was like, we had a king. So like there was no president. The US was not a thing yet. So I love that the leftover buildings, the existing buildings actually can physically connect us to the past.
Yes. You are 100% correct. And just giving that clarity and that really perception, I think about how many times do you have that conversation with individuals really? By your head nod, often.
Often, indeed.
It sounds like you continue to do a lot of the work in advocating, not only for people, of course, and you yourself serve as a good representation, an excellent representation, but also it's not something that's new to you. And can you give some people a little bit of context? Because I know personally, just from also being at UVA, but this is not the first time you've been an advocate, you've been in front of people, you've been kind of like walking, marching, all the things.
Right. Yep. So I'm assuming, so in 2006, so we led a march from the A school to the lawn. I think this was in response to, there was some sort of graffiti painted on Beta Bridge. There's also a couple other incidents that happened to other classmates on the lawn. So, I mean, UVA's had it's had its share of racist incidents throughout its existence. And so being able to actually have the conversation in architecture and how architecture relates to race and how it matters and why architects can't just be on the sideline. And the fact that architects do have a role in this conversation is something that it's a conversation I've been having for a while. And even at Quinn Evans, we now have a Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee. So I'm one of the members on that. Yes, that stands for JEDI, in case anyone was trying to do the acronym. And yes, I also like Star Wars, so now you know 2 more things about me. So anyway, so being able to have the conversations and talk about white supremacy in architecture at a 200-person firm that is predominantly white has been really mind-boggling this year, but in a good way, because it's one of those things where it's a conversation that needs to be had. And it's one of those things where I think a lot of times people don't understand the connections and how it matters. So for instance, one of the things that blew my mind recently was the idea and the conversation around the fact that lead exposure can lead to violent behavior. And this came up a lot because there was a study that was done that was looking at the shooters that were doing the shooting in Baltimore and other inner cities and where they lived as children. And so knowing that a lot of these shooters actually lived in affordable housing projects that had lead paint and were exposed to lead poisoning and never got treated for it, that then had different environmental and developmental effects on them. And then later they became more violent than they would have been likely otherwise because of their environment. So understanding the connection between safe, affordable housing and societal impacts that will have going down the road, like that was something that I was like even more convinced that yes, architecture has an impact on the social narrative.
Yes. And it's a quote, and I'm going to say it even though I butcher her name every time, but that aligns so closely and specifically with what has been said by other architects for years, frankly. And I agree with you. It's a conversation that comes up over and over. And unfortunately, it's usually driven by an architect of color and likely a woman. And Norma Merrick Skolaric had a statement years ago, and she had mentioned how architecture is a part of not only the environment, but it really should be a way of improving the homes and buildings and the places of work for individuals. And I think that speaks exactly to what you're saying, that
Right.
architects need to be in those conversations, and for various reasons that affect not only housing, but health and education.
Right. Exactly.
It's mind-boggling sometimes to think that there's a separation, or that a construct is formed without the adequate and appropriate voices that really need
Right.
to be in that room. Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. And often it's just architecture often gets siloed. And so we often start kind of only talking to other architects. And same with preservation. So when I was at Penn doing a dual degree, my architecture colleagues were like, oh, preservationists, they just get in the way. They want to save everything. You know, they're annoying basically. And then my preservation colleagues were like, oh, well, architects can't design, their buildings leak. Frank Lloyd Wright's buildings are falling apart. So it was one of those things where I was like, but wait a minute. Preservationists, job security from architects. You know, we want architects to keep designing so that we have something to preserve in 50 years. And then architects, I'm assuming you're designing buildings that you want a preservationist to preserve in 50 years. Like, it's definitely a symbiotic relationship that is needed. And it's one of those things where it's always, for me, it's just how I live my life because of who I am and how I've been, what I've been trained to do. But for me, it's always both and, as opposed to either or. And so being able to make sure that we make space at the table to have the conversations is something that's really important for me.
Yes, and you've mentioned it in different capacities of it's not a or, it's an and
Mm-hmm.
you are a representation of how that is translated both at work, outside of work, at home. If I may say, you are not alone as far as being an architect in your home.
It's true. I am not the only architect in my house.
Yes, yes. So I'm sure those conversations are probably not boring because I mean, you do different things, but still within the same realm and in depth.
It's interesting because so my husband is also an architect. That's who we're alluding to here. He's also a UVA graduated in 05.
Yeah.
But he's not a preservationist. There have been numerous times when I've tried to, we go on site visits, we're looking at historic buildings, and he'll just look around and be like, tear it down, start over. It's one of those things where it's a different sensibility. And so it's one of those, it's great to be able to have that companion who I can nerd out with about different designs and buildings and things like that. But the preservation side, it's definitely not what he gravitates towards.
Yes, yes. Well, kudos to marrying a who. That's so exciting. Another from the A school too.
Exactly.
Now, those that you would have conversations with about preservation, but also different aspects of architecture, I don't want to speak too much about things that I know are on your podcast or might be talks that you've given before, but Are there still individuals that you speak to frequently and often that
Mhm.
you've either met at UVA or through your journey of becoming
Yeah.
an architect?
There are. And so actually on the most recent podcast. Morgan Miles and Rashida Bowman, they were two former who's are with me at the A school. They graduated with me in 2006. We made up 100% of the Black students in our A school class of like 75 or so. And so we really grew together as friends, as women, as we've navigated our careers. And Morgan has gone into development instead of architecture. Rashid and I have gone on to become licensed architects. But it's been fascinating to see the world through their eyes. And then there's also other friends that I have also from the A school. You know, us A schoolers, we were nerdy and in the dungeon and all that stuff. So it was a very small and eclectic group.
That's right. What's up, Nakita?
I know. Hi, Helen.
Yeah, I saw Holland wave.
Yeah.
The other
Right, exactly. Right. Right. And so then outside of sorority sisters and classmates from, I guess, dorm mates rather, I lived in old dorms in Kent. And actually, fun fact, well, not so fun, my room burned down. It was one of the rooms in Kent that burned in 2002. And so for those of you who may have been RAs or anything, apparently our photos from our room were used for like 10 years because we've been the first fire in a long time. Anyways, little tidbit. And so, yeah, so it's been a lot of high school friends, sorority sisters, dorm mates, a couple people. It's been good.
Well, it sounds like it's a good group that not only connects, but like you mentioned, you all each have kind of gone a different route, so to speak, but still within the same realm or same arena, I would say.
Right.
And you've obviously learned and grown since then. As far as now, current, today, what projects that you can share are you working on?
Yeah, so currently I have projects of very different scales. So the renovation of the Baltimore Penn Station project. I'm doing the historical piece on that, and my company Quinn Evans is joint venturing with Gensler on that project. So Gensler's doing the new entry to the train station, and then Quinn Evans is doing the historic train station proper. And then also I'm working on the Ambassador Theater renovation, which is also in Baltimore. And that's a really cool Art Deco 1935 theater that we're turning into a community space that happens to have performance arts. And then at the smaller scale, I'm working on the redevelopment of the 800 block of Harlem and Edmondson Avenue, also in Baltimore. And so that's the renovation of about 38 different row houses that have been vacant for about 20 years. And so we're turning those back into affordable housing, but it's going to be for sale as opposed to for rent. So we're trying to improve home ownership in that neighborhood. So it's like from the scale of the row house, which is the historic row house, all the way up to the massive train station is the realm that I'm working in currently.
Right, that's a huge array, but I'm sure as an architect, that's immensely fun and energetic, and I can see why you're busy. And
Exactly.
different parts of your brain too, really, to kind of capture all those pieces, but in different ways.
Yeah, and it's fun because there's the design side of it, but then there's also the people and the project management side of it and navigating between the two. And oftentimes I feel like I'm just the conductor trying to make sure that everyone is doing the right work in the right order to make sure that we all get to the same destination. But it's been fun.
Yes, that is awesome. I definitely want to continue our conversation, but I want to be mindful and open it up for those that have questions. Sure. Or might want some clarity. It sounds like we have a bit of an array, some questions that have come through. So we have some people that are in the architecture field and others that are fans. So definitely put in the chat any questions you have, and I'll ask them as we keep going. But this is wonderful, and we definitely have a question about any other ventures that you are pursuing currently, in addition to your work at Quinn Evans.
Yeah, so it's, I guess it's a venture. So I started a podcast over the summer, and that is more so a way for me to process everything that's been happening and also share more of the connections that I've been seeing through the work that I've been doing. Realizing that I kind of hold a unique vantage point from a number of different areas, and just I like to talk, so figured I'd start a podcast. So it's been a good time. So that's called Tangible Remnants. I also am on a number of boards. So between kind of full-time work, being on boards, so in addition to Preservation Maryland, which I'd mentioned previously, I'm also on the advisory council for there's a initiative through the National Trust for Historic Preservation for historically Black colleges and universities and helping them create their preservation master plans. And so I'm on that advisory council, which is just starting as well. So it's really just board work and podcast. That's the breadth for now.
That is wonderful. And as someone that has heard some of your episodes in your podcast, very interesting work and easy to find. But one thing, your name, can you tell us a little bit about the name and how you came up with it?
Oh, for the podcast?
Yeah.
So Tangible Remnants. So it was really just trying to think through how do I encapsulate this so that it's really talking about, it gives the space to talk about a little bit of everything, and knowing that buildings really are the tangible remnant of something that happened, and then knowing that they become the framework for what we can talk about and how everything connects to it. And so there was, I'm pretty sure there was another like conversation I was having and another webinar I was listening to. And then I was talking to my husband one night and we were talking about it. And then it was like, as I said, I was like, no, but buildings are like the tangible remnants of this. And I was like, oh, that's the name of the podcast. Because before that, the name of the podcast was Sustainable and Historic. So, Tangible Remnants is a little bit stickier. Right.
Well, speaking of historic, definitely want to continue this conversation and think about some of the experiences you had. You had mentioned studying abroad, and in your experience with APTI and zero net carbon, do you see sustainability and preservation crossing more of a global level? And if so,
yes.
How?
Yes, man, that's such a good segue, and we didn't even plan that. So there's something called the Climate Heritage Network. And so that is really, Andrew Potts is leading that charge, but it's basically in a conglomeration of heritage networks from across the world that are working to answer the question of about to what extent do existing and historic buildings actually impact global carbon emissions, and how do we actually look at using these existing buildings towards decarbonization. And there was a report, the IPCC came out recently that talked about where we are in terms of climate change, what needs to happen, and the targets that we need to hit. And so basically the Climate Heritage Network, or CHN, was created to start answering that question. And so the Zero Net Carbon Collaborative, ZNCC, has a working group 3 that's working with CHN to really try and get to that question. And so we're doing case studies and doing a lot of reports and looking at embodied carbon. And there's just a lot of numbers and calculations that are being done to try and answer this question. So globally, yes, things are happening. And the fact that existing and heritage buildings need to be at the climate action conversation, it's starting to come to more fruition.
Good. That sounds like, thank you for answering that question and also expanding on where it's going. So we'll definitely keep that in mind, maybe for future events. I definitely want to continue that. In addition to that aspect of sustainability, I want to tap back in a little bit to creations and thoughts and architecture, and really the naming of architecture. What are your thoughts on creating an African-American architecture? And this question comes up from someone based on the notion that we have Roman architecture, we have Greek architecture, we have modern. So why not African-American?
So I think it's one of those things where it would be just an American architecture. Okay. I think that there are a number of, there are a number of African-American architects that have done things historically. So for instance, I'm thinking of Julian Abel, who designed a number of buildings at Duke University, even though he wasn't allowed into those buildings that he designed because #racism. But he designed a bunch of buildings there. There's also a number of, there is a difference in stability, but I'm just thinking, I don't know that it would be its own style, particularly because African-American isn't a monolith. There's so many layers and flavors to that. So I think it would still just be blended into the American narrative and the American aesthetic. But all that being said, it is interesting. One of my colleagues was telling me how he presented a drawing at a community meeting of this new building. And one of the women in the community, who was a really involved member of the community, she was looking at the drawing. She didn't realize that he was in the room, but she was like, oh, that drawing looks really white. And so that was a really interesting conversation of how does this drawing look white, and what information is this drawing telling you that's making you feel like you would be excluded from the space. And so kind of that conversation of aesthetics and what it looks like. So it's, I think it's an interesting question. I don't have an answer at the moment, but my gut is telling me that it would be blended into the American aesthetic as opposed to a one-off.
Thank you for that. It's interesting thoughts and rationale too. And speaking of rationale, I'm keeping my eye on the time, so I want to ask this question. It's a fun one. I always love asking. If you could work or collaborate with anyone, whether living or non, who would that be and why?
Anyone. Okay. Anyone. That's such a good one. So I mean, my fangirl architect obsession is Bjarke Ingels of Big Group, or Bjarke Ingels Group, Big. He's a Danish architect who does a lot of really fascinating buildings, but he's done a really great job of being able to communicate his design to people who are non-architects. And I think that's part of what's led him to fame, because it's his storytelling, the way he's using video, the way that he's actually explaining the design concept and what got him where, is something that I just find fascinating. And so anyways, he would be definitely high on the list. Yes.
That is awesome. Thank you. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
I definitely want to make sure that I thank you for just your time, your attention, your transparency, and the accolades, the advocacy work, all the positive representation. You are truly an asset, and I know I enjoyed this conversation, so hopefully those listening enjoyed it as well. And I think no one would say no if we did a round two at some point.
Well, awesome. Well, thank you. I'm so grateful and flattered to have been able to come on and share more of my world and my vision. And I just,
Yes.
as you can tell, I get excited about this stuff. So I enjoy
I
doing
find it fascinating, so I'm glad that other people did too.
Awesome.
Yeah, so those that are listening, thank you so much. I am going to put some information in the chat if you do want to follow up with Nakita or just hear more about what's going on, and definitely continue to either put your name on the list or reach out to me directly if you want to hear about more events that we have coming up. Once again, I'm Kim Edwards and representing the DC chapter, but since we're virtual, we are definitely expanding. And if there's anyone that wants to continue to have the conversation, reach out, because like I said, I definitely think we need to have a part two of our conversation tonight.
Sounds good. Well, thank you, Kim. Thank you everyone for listening. I appreciate you spending your time with us.
Thank you. And everyone have a great evening, and thank you all so much.